The fluorescent lights of the courtroom were harsh and unforgiving. They glinted off the polished wood of the bench and the faint sheen of sweat on the defendant's forehead. Her name, according to the docket, was Jane Doe, but to the thousands watching, she was simply the girl in the gray cardigan, fidgeting with the hem as Judge Judy's relentless gaze bore down on her. "I'm going to start with you," Judge Judy said, her voice a low rumble that cut through the low hum of the air conditioning. She pointed a manicured finger at the defendant. "You and Ms. Morgan worked together. Is that how you met?" Jane Doe swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am." "And you needed a place to stay?" "Yes, ma'am." The answers came out as barely audible whispers, each one followed by a slight dip of her head. She looked like a student called to the front of the class, unprepared and hoping to disappear. Her eyes darted around the courtroom, avoiding the plaintiff, Ms. Morgan, who sat ramrod straight on the other side, her expression a tight mask of exasperation. "Why did you need a place to stay?" Judy's voice was getting sharper, the questions coming faster, like a prosecutor cornering a reluctant witness. "I was currently staying in a hotel and I couldn't afford to keep staying there." A collective murmur rippled through the gallery. The camera zoomed in on Jane Doe's face, catching the fleeting shadow of shame and exhaustion. For months, the hotel had been her gilded cage. The king-size bed was comfortable, the cleaning staff made it spotless every day, and the miniature shampoos were a small luxury. But with every passing week, the sterile air and impersonal decor had started to feel suffocating. Loneliness was a constant companion, amplified by the thin walls that let in the muffled sounds of other people's lives. Families laughing, couples arguing, the low thrum of a TV. She tried to make the room a home, rearranging the furniture, but it was impossible. Every corner, every surface screamed transience. It was a place for a night, maybe two, but not for a life. The credit card she'd been using was maxed out, and the cash she kept hidden under the mattress was dwindling faster than she could replenish it. The pressure was a cold, hard knot in the pit of her stomach. Every ding of the elevator felt like the sound of her financial freedom slipping away. "How much were you paying at the hotel?" Judy's voice snapped her back to the present. $1,300 a month. The number hung in the air, a staggering weight. A faint oof could be heard from someone in the gallery. Judy leaned back, her eyes narrowing as she processed the information. Her body language was an open book of skepticism. "And how much were you earning?" "I get anywhere from 3. I'm a server, so it really depends." Jane Doe's hands twisted in her lap. The restaurant, a bustling, brightly lit place with a sports bar vibe, was where the two worlds, her costly hotel life and Ms. Morgan's stable one, collided. She had met Ms. Morgan on the floor, their relationship born out of shared misery over rude customers and long hours. Their conversations had started with small talk, gossip about a manager, complaints about a table that stiffed them, before evolving into something deeper. It was during a slow Tuesday night while they were polishing silverware that Jane had confided in her about her living situation. She hadn't meant to, it just came out, a jumble of frustration and fatigue about living out of a suitcase and eating takeout every night. Ms. Morgan had listened, her face soft with a sympathy Jane hadn't expected. She was a woman who seemed to have her life together, steady, grounded, and living in a nice two-bedroom apartment. The thought of asking for help was mortifying, but Ms. Morgan's quiet kindness had made it feel less impossible. Jane recalled the moment Ms. Morgan had offered to help, the words spoken so casually they almost sounded like a joke. "You know, my roommate just moved out. The place is too big for me alone. You could have her room." The offer had felt like a lifeline thrown from a ship to a person drowning. The sheer relief was so overwhelming that it had almost brought her to tears. "Got it," Judy said, a hint of impatience in her tone. "And Ms. Morgan worked at the same place?" "Yes." "She offered you to come to stay with her and you would split the rent. There were just the two of you there?" "No, ma'am. In the beginning, she offered to help." The words tumbled out, a desperate attempt to correct the narrative. It wasn't about splitting the rent. It was an act of charity, a rescue mission. The distinction was critical to Jane, but Judge Judy wasn't buying it. Judy's face hardened. She held up a hand, silencing Jane's stammered explanation. "Listen." She paused for dramatic effect, leaning forward and planting her hands on the bench. The air in the courtroom grew heavy. She doesn't know you other than both being a server at a restaurant, right? So why would she? The question hung in the air, loaded with suspicion. Judy's voice was filled with an implicit accusation. Why would a stranger, an acquaintance from work, offer to take on the liability of an unstable person who couldn't afford a hotel? What's the real story here? The contrast between the two living situations was stark, a chasm of financial disparity. 1,300 a month for a transient hotel room versus a mere $325 a month for a stable home. The math was simple, and the relief Jane had felt was immense. It wasn't just about saving money, it was about getting her life back. It was about having a kitchen to cook in, a permanent place to hang her clothes, and a real address to put on her bills. It felt like an almost miraculous second chance. In mid-September 2016, she moved in. The transition was quick and painless. She had few belongings, a couple of suitcases and a small box of personal items. It had felt like the beginning of a new chapter, a fresh start. Judge Judy, with the practiced eye of a seasoned skeptic, was now doing the math aloud, her voice a low, methodical drone. September, you moved in. You would have paid September, right? Yes, ma'am. And you paid October? Yes, ma'am. And you paid November? A long silence. Jane Doe's body language screamed her answer before she even spoke. She shifted in her seat, her gaze dropping to the floor. The relief she had felt weeks ago was now replaced by a familiar knot of dread. The silence stretched, a tense, expectant void. The camera panned to Ms. Morgan, who was now nodding grimly, as if in confirmation. No, ma'am, Jane finally whispered. Judy's expression didn't change, but her eyes, cold and sharp, darted from the defendant to the plaintiff. So you moved in September, she reiterated, as if counting on her fingers. You paid September, you paid October, but you did not pay November. The statement was not a question. It was a declaration, a stark and damning fact laid bare for all to see. The hopeful narrative of a new beginning had come crashing down, replaced by the reality of a broken agreement. The finality of Judy's tone hung heavy in the air, a silent accusation that set the stage for the conflict to come. The first act was over, and the tension had just begun to build. The court clerk's voice was a flat administrative drone as he called the case. Next case, Morgan versus Doe. A palpable shift in energy occurred as the plaintiff, Ms. Morgan, and the defendant, Jane Doe, were called to the front. The stage was set, and the star of the show, Judge Judy, was ready to begin her interrogation. I mean, you're not her sister, Judge Judy stated, her voice a sharp-edged blade cutting through the air. She fixed Jane Doe with a stare that seemed to see straight through her. You're not her cousin. You're not her niece. You're not anybody to her other than somebody who she knew from work, who was paying $300 a month in a hotel, who couldn't afford it. Jane's shoulders slumped. She looked like a small bird caught in a net, desperate to escape, but with no clear path to freedom. The weight of the judge's words, the thinly veiled accusation that she had taken advantage of a stranger's kindness, was almost too much to bear. Yes, ma'am, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Judge Judy's gaze shifted slightly, taking in Ms. Morgan, then returning to the defendant. She had a way of using her body, a lean, a gesture, a pointed finger to control the entire space. And she had an apartment, she continued, her voice low and menacing. She lived alone? Jane Doe's head gave a quick, almost imperceptible shake. She didn't have anywhere at that moment. Judy's eyes narrowed. Was she living alone? She repeated, her tone now firm and demanding. Jane's gaze was fixed on the floor. She gave a small nod. Mm-hmm. So she was living alone, Judy said, a slow, deliberate cadence in her voice. And how many bedrooms are in her apartment? 2. The apartment. The word hung in the air, conjuring a mental image of a place that, for a brief time, had felt like a refuge. It wasn't a palatial suite, but it was a home. It was on the second floor of a nondescript building, with a small balcony overlooking a parking lot. The living room was comfortable with a worn sofa and a large TV. The kitchen was modest but functional. Jane's room, the spare bedroom, was small, but it was hers. She had a bed, a dresser, and a small closet. It was a space that was separate and private, a stark contrast to the transient, anonymity of the hotel. It felt like a solid foundation, something she could build on. But with every passing day, the sense of security was accompanied by a subtle unease. The shared living space was a constant negotiation. The unspoken rules about guests, about kitchen cleanup, about noise. The two-bedroom layout was a blessing and a curse. It gave them both a sense of privacy, but it also highlighted the fact that they were roommates, not family. Their conversations had become more strained, their interactions more formal. The initial glow of Ms. Morgan's generosity had begun to fade, replaced by the mundane realities of living with a stranger. Judy was still speaking, her voice a steady drumbeat of reality. "Too easy. You come move in with me. We'll split the rent." How much was the rent? $650. In total? Judy asked, a faint lift of an eyebrow. Yes, every month. The number was a punch to the gut. The memory of the hotel with its exorbitant rate and emotional drain seemed a lifetime ago. $650. Split in half. $325. It wasn't just a number, it was a promise of a new life. The relief Jane had felt was immense, a wave of gratitude that had almost brought her to her knees. Ms. Morgan's offer had not just saved her money, it had saved her. But as she sat there under the relentless gaze of Judge Judy, the question of why Ms. Morgan had made the offer came back to haunt her. Was it out of genuine compassion, a deep-seated need to help someone in trouble? Or was it something else? Maybe Ms. Morgan was struggling too. Maybe her roommate had left suddenly and she needed help covering the rent. The two-bedroom apartment was too expensive for one person, even at $650 a month. Was the offer a mix of altruism and pragmatism? A way to help a coworker while also helping herself? The courtroom was silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning and the soft rustle of papers. Jane Doe's hands, which had been clutching her cardigan, now lay still in her lap. Her head was bowed, her face a mask of shame and regret. She had failed to live up to the promise of this second chance. The generosity of a near stranger, the hope of a fresh start, had all been squandered. She had only paid for 2 months, September and October, and now it was November, and she was sitting in a courtroom with the woman who had helped her now suing her for the unpaid rent. Judy leaned forward, her voice low and conspiratorial, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "So $650 cut in half, right?" "Yes, ma'am." The simplicity of the deal was what made the betrayal so profound. It was a fair arrangement, a simple exchange of money for a place to live. And yet, it had gone so wrong. The generosity of a coworker had turned into a lawsuit. The promise of a new life had become a public spectacle. The tension in the room was palpable, a silent hum of judgment and disappointment. The audience watched, rapt, as the two women sat on opposite sides of the aisle, their shared history now a matter of public record, their lives reduced to a financial transaction gone awry. The stage was set, the characters were in place, and the reason for the conflict was crystal clear. The question was no longer about why Ms. Morgan had helped, but about why Jane Doe had failed to pay. And that, Judge Judy's silence seemed to imply, was a story for the next part of the trial. The courtroom air had grown thick with unspoken accusation. Judge Judy sat on her bench, her face a mask of stone, and her voice, what had been a low rumble, was now a cold, deliberate measure of facts. She was a human calculator, and the number she was tallying did not add up. "So your share of the rent would have been $300," she began, her eyes fixed on the defendant, Jane Doe. "Yes, ma'am," Jane replied, the words a desperate plea for a different story to be told, "as opposed to $1,300. "Mm-hmm," Jane said, a small nod of her head accompanying the sound. "That sounds like a pretty good deal to me." The statement was a rhetorical hook, bait for the defendant to agree, to concede the obvious truth of her good fortune. A long, tense pause followed. Judy leaned back, and for a moment the silence was deafening, broken only by the click of the stenographer's machine. It was a silence filled with the weight of her authority, her ability to dissect a story and expose its contradictions. The cameras, the gallery, even the courtroom staff seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the next calculated blow. "When did you move in?" she asked, the question deceptively simple. "About the middle of September 2016. This was the first time the plaintiff, Ms. Morgan, intervened. She had been sitting in stoic silence, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, but now she leaned forward slightly. September 16th, to be exact, ma'am. Her voice was tight with frustration, a mix of anger and the quiet satisfaction of a person who knew they were right. Judy looked over at her, a quick, sharp glance. Don't shout out again. Otherwise, I'm going to just dismiss your case. The threat was effective and Ms. Morgan retreated into her silence. But the point had been made. The timeline was precise, and the plaintiff was keeping track. Judy turned back to Jane, her expression hardening. She held up her right hand, ticking off dates on her fingers like a teacher instructing a slow student. September to October, October to November, November to December. 3 months. She lowered her hand, her gaze unblinking. How many times did you pay her rent? Jane hesitated. Her eyes flickered to the floor, then to Ms. Morgan, then back to the judge. The truth was a moving target, and she was trying to hit it. But the judge was too fast, too experienced. 3. The lie hung in the air, a flimsy shield against the inevitable. It was a reflex, an automatic attempt to protect herself from the shame of her failure. But Judge Judy was not looking for reflexive answers. She was looking for the truth, and she had the receipts. She had read Jane's own written testimony, her statement of claim, her version of events. She had already found the crack in the facade. How much did you give her each month? Judy asked, her voice dangerously calm. $320 for rent, and it varied each month as far as no. The single word, delivered with the force of a hammer blow, silenced her. The courtroom felt as if it had collectively flinched. The look on Judge Judy's face wasn't anger. It was a profound disappointment, a cool, detached judgment of a lie. She was not just a judge. She was an arbiter of human nature, and she was pointing out the defendant's fundamental flaw. Her inability to be honest even when caught. She had the defendant's written answer, a document that Jane had submitted herself, outlining her case. Judy had committed the details to memory, and she was using them to dismantle Jane's story, piece by painful piece. Jane had admitted to not paying the first month's rent in that document. Now, in front of the cameras in the courtroom, she was changing her story, claiming to have paid all 3 months. The inconsistency was a gaping wound in her credibility, and Judge Judy was about to pour salt in it. The defendant's face flushed a deep red. She looked like a trapped animal, a desperate twitch in her eye as she looked for a way out. The truth was that she had paid in October and November. The September payment, the very first payment, had been the one she had skipped. Why? The details were a blur of financial strain, of juggling bills and hoping for a better tip night. She had convinced herself that she would catch up, that a month wouldn't matter. But it did. It mattered to Ms. Morgan, and it certainly mattered to Judge Judy. The tension in the courtroom was a living thing, humming with the weight of the lie. Ms. Morgan, the plaintiff, watched Jane with a quiet, bitter satisfaction. Her own silent truth was now being spoken for her, validated by the highest authority in the room. This wasn't just about the money, it was about the principle, about the simple honesty of a deal made between two people. Judge Judy leaned forward, her eyes never leaving Jane's face. So you paid her $325 each month for rent. The statement was a question, but it was also an accusation. She was giving Jane one last chance to admit the truth. The courtroom was silent, and the clock ticked. The lie had been told, and now it was time for the judgment to begin. The final act was about to start, and it was clear that the defendant's story was already coming apart at the seams. The courtroom exchange was a verbal ballet of evasion and accusation. The defendant, Jane, had just been caught in a blatant lie about her rent payments, and the air was thick with her nervous energy. Judge Judy, however, was far from finished. She had exposed the financial untruths, but now she was ready to dissect the true petty grievances of shared living. The rent was only the beginning. The real conflict, as Judy knew, lay in the small, daily disputes that festered beneath the surface. So you lived there for 3 months, but according to your own answer, you only paid rent for 2 months, Judy stated, her voice a calm, low hum that felt more threatening than any shout. The statement was not a question. It was an established fact. Jane, cornered, finally caved. Yes, ma'am. In the beginning, she agreed to help me out. I told her that I can help out with what I can, but we didn't have a... So you didn't pay rent for 1 month, Judy interjected, cutting off Jane's attempt at a rambling defense. The judge was a master of focusing on the core issue, stripping away all the emotional padding. I paid every month I was there, Jane insisted, a last-ditch effort to rewrite history. The desperation in her voice was palpable, a frantic attempt to reclaim some shred of credibility. You didn't pay, Judy began, her voice rising slightly. I asked you 2 seconds ago. I said, how many months did you pay? And you just told me 3. Now you're saying every month I was there. What is the truth? The truth, as it turned out, was messy. The financial arrangement, which had started as a simple, benevolent deal, had quickly devolved into a series of mismatched expectations. Ms. Morgan, the plaintiff, had expected a straightforward partnership, but Jane had approached it as a kind of sliding scale of contribution based on her fluctuating income. The fight about bills began almost immediately. It was a slow burn, a series of small, frustrating exchanges that chipped away at the initial goodwill. It started with the bundled cable and internet bill. She demanded I pay part of the cable, Jane explained, her voice gaining a new self-righteous indignation. This was a battle she believed she could win, even though I didn't use the TV. The argument was a perfect example of their different mindsets. To Jane, the bill was a collection of separate services, and she should only pay for what she used. Her focus was on her own needs. To Ms. Morgan, it was a single package, a household expense that was to be shared equally. It was a matter of principle, a symbol of fairness. I only wanted to pay half of the Wi-Fi, Jane said, her voice now firm and confident. The Wi-Fi was only $39.99. She was a server. She had to be a master of mental math, and she had already calculated what she owed, down to the last penny. But Ms. Morgan saw the situation differently. The debate over the cable was just the beginning. The real unspoken tension in the household came from a third person, Andrew, Jane's boyfriend. He had moved in, not in an official capacity, but in a quiet, insidious way. He was there every night, his presence a silent, growing elephant in the room. He ate their food, used their electricity, and took up space. He was a silent partner in the household, enjoying all the benefits of shared living without contributing a single cent. Ms. Morgan's resentment grew with every passing day. The initial generosity she had shown to her coworker was now being taken advantage of by 2 people. She had opened her home to a friend in need, not to a couple looking for a cheap living arrangement. The unspoken question hung in the air. Should Andrew also be paying rent? Judy's questions were designed to expose this deeper conflict. She was not just asking about money. She was asking about fairness, about the social contract of shared living. She understood that a 2-bedroom apartment that had been a safe haven for one person was now a crowded, tense space for 3. The unspoken resentment, the quiet anger over a boyfriend who was always there but never paid, was the real reason for the lawsuit. The arguments over bills became more frequent. Nights that had once been filled with easy conversation were now punctuated by rising voices, accusations, and silent, seething anger. The initial kindness had been replaced by a growing sense of mistrust. Jane felt that Ms. Morgan was being unreasonable, demanding money for services she didn't use. Ms. Morgan felt that Jane was taking advantage of her, using her generosity as a free ride. The December fight was the boiling point. The small arguments had been simmering for weeks, and they finally exploded. The air was filled with shouted accusations and angry tears. The 2 women who had once shared a common bond as co-workers were now bitter enemies, their friendship a distant memory. The apartment, once a sanctuary from the hotel, was now a battleground. The argument over the bills was just the final flimsy excuse for a much larger conflict. The real issue was that a simple act of kindness had become a complex, messy, and deeply personal dispute. The courtroom exchange was a taut wire humming with the static of unspoken accusations. Judge Judy, with her characteristic precision, had just dismantled Jane's flimsy defense, revealing the truth about the unpaid rent. But the financial betrayal, as both women knew, was only the flimsy excuse for a much larger, more violent confrontation. The arguments over bills and the simmering resentment over the boyfriend, Andrew, had finally boiled over in a spectacular, chaotic explosion on December 20th. The very air in the courtroom felt charged, pregnant with the anticipation of what came next. "So far, am I right?" Judy asked, her gaze sweeping between the plaintiff and the defendant. "You had a fight. You had a big fight." "Yes, ma'am," Jane replied, her voice barely a whisper. The memory of that night was a raw, festering wound, a nightmarish replay of sound and fury. It hadn't been a simple argument. It had been a cataclysm, a total and complete destruction of what little goodwill remained. The tensions that had been building for weeks, over cable bills, over the constant, unpaying presence of Andrew, over the sheer injustice of it all, had finally shattered in a moment of pure, unbridled rage. The fight had started, as so many do, with a single small spark, a misplaced kitchen item, a passive-aggressive comment. The details were a blur, but the emotions were not. They had started with raised voices, then moved to accusations. Jane had accused Ms. Morgan of being petty and unreasonable, of demanding money for services she didn't even use. Ms. Morgan had accused Jane of being a user, taking advantage of a kindness she didn't deserve. The words had escalated, growing more venomous and personal with each passing second, until they were no longer just arguing about money, but about character. The conflict, however, had not remained purely verbal. It had spilled out of the confines of words and into the physical world, a world of ruined property and bruised bodies. "She claimed that I damaged or stripped the bed," Jane said, her voice now filled with a new, indignant energy. "She came in and started shouting, and I told her to leave my room. She said I had to leave. I told her I wasn't leaving until I could get all my things. I had already taken the bed apart and put the mattress on the floor so it would be easier to move out later." Jane's version was one of rational, preemptive action, of an unstable living arrangement being dismantled for a swift exit. She had not damaged the bed. She had simply prepared it for removal. It was a perfectly logical and, in her mind, completely defensible action. But Ms. Morgan's version of the events was different. She had not simply disassembled the bed. She had torn it apart in a fit of rage, leaving a splintered mess of wood and metal. The bed, she claimed, was an expensive piece of furniture, and Jane had deliberately rendered it unusable out of spite. The bed, she insisted, was her property, and Jane had no right to damage it. She gestured toward her file, a thick packet of photos and receipts. The photos, though taken in the aftermath, showed a scene of domestic devastation, a disassembled bed frame with broken slats, a mattress askew on the floor, and a general air of chaos. This was a classic he said, she said scenario, one that Judy had seen 1,000 times. The bed, the very symbol of the home they once shared, was now a battleground. One woman saw destruction, the other saw practicality. Judy looked from one to the other, her face a blank slate of skepticism. Without a third-party witness or physical evidence, the truth was an elusive ghost. But there were other grievances, ones just as petty and just as painful. Mrs. Morgan accused Jane of stealing. "She took my towels and my linens, Judge," Ms. Morgan declared, her voice cracking with the emotional weight of her accusation. "And my pillowcases, all of it. She took my belongings." The missing linens and towels, in Ms. Morgan's mind, were proof of a calculated final act of betrayal. She had opened her home, shared her life, and now her towels were gone. Jane, however, had her own list of grievances. Her counterclaim was a story of humiliation and anger. The fight had escalated, and in the chaos, Ms. Morgan had allegedly taken Jane's clothes and spread them across the living room floor. And not just that, she had allegedly dumped wet cereal on them. "She got so mad, she took my clothes and threw them on the floor," Jane testified, a look of profound violation on her face. "And then she took a bowl of wet cereal and dumped it on my clothes." It was an act of pure, unadulterated anger, a childish tantrum that had destroyed her property. The culmination of the fight, however, was a shocking and terrifying moment of physical violence. The courtroom held its breath as Jane described the confrontation. "She tackled me," Jane said, her voice trembling, "like a football tackle. She went after me and I had to push back." The admission, "I shoved back in defense," was both a confession and a plea. She had not initiated the violence, but she had participated in it. She was admitting to a physical confrontation, in the one place where she had to be honest, and that honesty was painful. The fight ended with Jane, heartbroken and defeated, leaving the apartment without her things. She returned the next day, on December 21st, with a police escort. The police, however, were not there to settle a dispute. They were simply there to prevent a second altercation while Jane collected her belongings. And when she returned, she found her clothes, just as she had described, spread out on the floor, covered in soggy cereal. It was an act of petty, deliberate cruelty. But the police escort, so clinical and detached, had not been there to take pictures. And in a courtroom without pictures, there was no evidence. The police could only report what they saw, and what they saw was an emotional mess, not a provable crime. Judy, with a weary sigh, held up a hand. The two women's stories were a tangled mess of accusations and counter-accusations. Property damage, missing linens, dumped cereal, a physical altercation. All of it was a chaotic, unprovable mess. She knew with the certainty of a judge who had seen it all that these claims were impossible to verify. A bed could have been damaged in 1,000 ways. A towel could have been misplaced. The cereal could have been spilled by anyone. The physical confrontation was a he said, she said that would never be resolved. But the one thing that was not in dispute was the rent. The one thing that was provable, that was written down in a contract, was the financial arrangement that had brought them to her courtroom in the first place. Judy, with a final, decisive gesture, held up the file, the very file that contained Jane's own written admission. She was not a mediator of petty grievances. She was a judge of law. "This is all a big mess," Judy said, her voice filled with a finality that brooked no argument. "The bed, the towels, the cereal, all of it. I don't know who did what to whom. I don't have any evidence. All I have is the fact that you lived in her home for 3 months and you only paid rent for 2. That I can prove. All the rest of this is dismissed." She paused, looking directly at Jane. "You owe her $300 for rent." The verdict was swift and uncompromising. All the drama, the personal animosity, the ruined clothes, the alleged tackles, all of it was swept away with a single wave of Judy's hand. The case was not about revenge, not about settling scores, but about a simple legal contract. And in that contract, Jane was in the wrong. The show ended, as it always did, with the bitter post-case interviews. Ms. Morgan, standing outside the courtroom, spoke of her betrayal. "I helped her out when she had no one else. I gave her a place to stay. And this is what I get." Jane, for her part, spoke of the injustice. "She just wanted to make me look bad. She's a liar. I paid my share. It's not my fault her bed was falling apart. She's just a bitter person." The two women, once co-workers, once friends, were now bitter enemies, their relationship reduced to a simple legal judgment. The case was closed. The lesson, however, lingered. It was a lesson about the fragile nature of kindness, the corrosive power of unspoken resentment, and the truth that, in the end, no amount of drama can hide a simple financial fact.